Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started in just a moment. There's a few more people that are joining. Okay, well, let's get started. It's nice to see so many of you on this rainy, sort of still rainy New York City night. I'm Joel Whitney. I help the team that puts together the arts and culture events here at Brooklyn Public Library, also known as BPL Presents. And it's a pleasure to present Avram Alpert's The Good Enough Life, this book, which was slated to come out this week, which it'll now come out in a few weeks. We'll still encourage you to pre-order it. It's a really interesting book. I'm going to bring Ian Olasoff, our series curator. This is, of course, Philosophy in the Library. This is a monthly series. Many of you know it. Many of you are regulars, and we're happy to have you back. I just want to mention really quickly, this comes out of a series that we do, an annual, usually overnight event with the Cultural Services of the French Embassy. Many of you know it, sometimes known as Night of Philosophy, now better known as Night of Ideas. I can't tell you officially that this is coming back. We postponed this year's. I can't tell you to hold May 21st because this is all embargoed information, but this book has a history, a connection to Night of Ideas, Night of Philosophy, and I just want to set that up before handing it over to our very capable and wonderful curator, Ian. We do a series sometimes at Night of Ideas that we call an op-ed, philosophy op-ed writing workshop with the Stone blog at the New York Times, and Peter Catapano has been the longtime editor of that. And there was an op-ed, The Good Enough Life by Avi, that Peter was really, he heard it in the live workshop at Night of Ideas. He encouraged a full draft. He published it in the New York Times, and the rest is history. I think the smart editors over at Princeton University Press saw it. I think they already knew Avi's work. Avi can correct me if I'm wrong about any of this. And so this book is now coming out this month, amidst a whole bunch of other things that the BPL Presents team is doing. And I want to remind you that the Lenape-Hoking exhibition, the first exhibition of art and panels and histories curated by Lenape community members and leaders in a major New York institution, is ongoing through the end of April, and there's going to be an afterlife in the form of an anthology, so keep your eye on those. In fact, next week and throughout April, there's actually the most kind of intensive amount of these events as we wind that down. And we have our ongoing author talks and everything else. And my colleague Binyam, who's there as BPL Presents, he'll drop information in the chat so that you can follow all that, including our Facebook page where this is being streamed to. So if you want to watch this again later, you can do that there. But I also want to shout out Brooklyn Public Philosophers, and you can follow them as well. We're going to put that in the chat too. And their kind of founder and mensch in charge is the curator for this series. That's Ian Olasoff, also an author in his own right, whose book we featured when it came out, I think 2 years ago. Is that right? So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ian. We'll welcome you and welcome Avi. Cheers.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joel. Yeah, I'll keep this brief. Yeah, I've spent the last couple of weeks reading Avi's book, and it is very good. I mean, I think like maybe one way to begin to get it, what makes it good is that I think a lot of people get into philosophy, or they turn to philosophy when they're in some sort of time of tumult in their own life, like they're dealing with some personal stress or unmooring, or they sort of don't know how to orient themselves, or don't know what their values or their worldview should be. And unfortunately, I think if you turn to philosophy, a lot of the time you'll come up short. A lot of philosophy that's written today doesn't address these sorts of questions or people dealing with these sorts of issues. But I think this book does, in a way that's both like really compelling and readable, but is also like, it's capital P philosophy. I mean, it's rigorous stuff. So, you know, that's my blurb for it, I guess. But Avi, do you want to start by just taking a few minutes to like describe the book, to give a sort of overview, and then we can talk about it a bit?
Sure. Yeah, and let me just start by saying thanks to Ian and Joel and everyone who's working to make this event possible. And as Joel mentioned, this started at the Brooklyn Public Library. I had this idea, and then I saw this contest. I sent it in, and things just kind of built from there. And I don't know what would have become of this idea without the Brooklyn Public Library. And a lot of the point that I'm making in the book is about public goods and the value of kind of having things shared and in common. And of course, public libraries are part of that. And so, you know, it's really great. This is the kind of first big public event that I'm doing for the launch of the book. So it's lovely to have it back where it started. I'll just kind of give a general overview of the book and try and give you some of the kind of key points, or even just some of the outline of it, and then we can get into the details as we go. I think about the book as along the lines of what Ian was saying. You know, how do we respond to difficulty? How do we respond to tragedy? How do we respond to the fact that life is imperfect, is difficult, is almost inevitably flawed in some ways? And in the book, I kind of trace, I mean, there are many possible reactions, but I trace two that I try to kind of synthesize and lay out. One is this good enough model. And it really says, okay, life is never going to be more than good enough. There's always going to be accidents and betrayals and all these difficulties. It's just part of our condition. And so what do we do? Well, within that space, what I say in the book is that, you know, the kinks in our condition are best born through the connections to our kindred. And if we live in a world in which people are robust in themselves, they are good, they are decent, they have what they need, they have their emotional needs met, they have their social needs met, their environment is functioning and strong and sustainable, it's not overexploited, it's not overused, it's treated also as good and enough, then we're going to be able to help each other out better. We're going to be better for each other. We're going to be able to bear some of the burden of existence better together. And that this is not only therefore a moral vision, but a just sort of practical one, right? That we'll have a better life if everyone around us is doing well. And I really love the phrase, I'll say more about it in a minute, but good enough so nicely combines that what we are as humans are beings who need both decency, purpose, meaning, a sense of fairness and justice, all the things we think about with the good, but also all the things we think about with enough, right? We also are material beings, and we need food, we need shelter, we need clothing, we need education, we need healthcare, and that these things are linked, right? Because we also have emotional and social needs that need to be met through our ability to give care, to receive care, to bond with others, to be in community. And so I lay out that kind of broad vision in the book. I think in some ways it's a straightforward moral vision, but I think sometimes there's a way in which it gets usurped by another way of responding to the imperfections of life. And this is what I generally call the greatness model. And greatness is I don't know, it's a word that I use because there's a long-standing kind of philosophical distinction between the great, as in the kind of powerful, or those who have influence over other people's lives, and the good, as in those who are kind of moral and decent. And you can find it in Adam Smith. I mentioned John Milton sort of says, you know, Jesus is not great, but good. And this is kind of what makes him the character of the Christian story. So there's, you know, that's kind of where some of that language comes from. But the way that I use greatness, or what I'm thinking about here, is there are various systems in the world that we can say kind of divide us from each other, encourage us to competition, make things unequal or unfair. And I was kind of interested in the moral vision that undergirded or underpinned a lot of them. And I want to give fair due to this vision of life, because I think there's some real logic here. Basically, what I think of as greatness is saying life is imperfect, and we have a limited amount of resources and time and abilities, and some people have amazing talents. And what we should do as a society is put all of our energy and our time and our resources into those people. And by doing that, right? They're going to come up with the inventions that are going to make our lives easier. They're going to deal with the climate crisis. They're going to deal with food scarcity. They're going to come up with new artistic works or works of fiction or music that's going to entertain us and help us, through these difficult times in our lives. And there's some real truth to this model, right? There are people who are extremely talented out there, and I don't want to deny that. But for reasons maybe we can talk about more through the night, I think we lose a lot more when we put too much into some and not enough into somebody else. And so the very origin of this phrase, good enough, I take it like some other people who've kind of used the phrase good enough from a psychoanalyst named Donald Winnicott. And Winnicott worked mostly on familial relations, parent, child, and so forth. And he had this idea of the good enough mother. And Winnicott's idea is very straightforward. I think we probably today would call it good enough parent, but same principle in many ways. And he's basically saying, when you have a child, of course you want to be great. You want to be a great parent. I mean, hopefully, right? You want to be a parent who really cares for your child and supports them and gives them everything you need, and you don't want them to suffer, and you really want the best for them. And that's very logical. But Winnicott says, if you actually play this out, if you actually think through what happens, it's not good for the parent or for the child, right? The parent is stressed out, is overworked, is trying to create a world that just doesn't exist because suffering is somehow part of our existence. It can't be completely removed. And the child needs to learn that. And the great parent who's trying to overcome that is keeping the child from learning that lesson, and therefore keeping the child from being creative, being adaptable, developing all their capacities to kind of be a full, complex, strange, wonderful human being. And so I think that model that Winnicott talked about happens in all sorts of realms of greatness, right? When we put too much into too few, we miss out on so much else. And so the book tries to develop this vision of a world, of our individual, kind of how we think about who we are, who we want to be, of our relationships, of our societies, and our place in nature, that tries to embrace this kind of decency, sufficiency, and imperfection for all. So that's the kind of broad strokes of it. And yeah, and I'm really happy to talk a bit more about it and then eventually take some questions from everyone out there.
Yeah, thanks. And I think just to make it clear, because I think that the title might be deceiving to some people. It might seem on the face of it like this is a book sort of purely devoted to sort of self-help, or just about sort of getting your own life right and getting your own priorities straight or something like that. And there is that in there. There is a wealth of suggestions about how to get your own priorities straight. But it's also I think this really ambitious sort of economic vision for sort of how social life could be structured. I like that there's a sort of Trojan horse type thing going on there, that like somebody might be looking for self-help and get that and a lot more with it. Maybe just because we were talking about greatness, we can just talk about this for a second. I mean, one thing that stood out to me in reading the book was that it seemed like greatness appeared in two guises, or maybe greatness was sometimes meant two different things. Like sometimes it was about social status or prestige or hierarchy. It's about like dominating people or getting to the top of some social ladder or something. And then sometimes it's about a sort of merely apparent kind of good. Like you have this quote from W.E.B. Du Bois where he talks about people sort of flaunting their wealth in this tawdry and flamboyant way. Or in the case of in the case of Winnicott, it's like, being a great parent, but actually sort of smothering and overprotecting your child. Well, that seems good, but it's not really, So there are these two types of greatness, or I don't know, guises of greatness, whatever you want to call it. Social hierarchy on the one hand, and then the sort of like these things that seem good, but if you think about it, they're not really. And I guess one question we might start out with is just like, what's the relationship between those two things? What are they sort of the same thing if you dig deep down, or are they somehow intimately related? Yeah. Yeah,
no, and just to respond to the first set of points you made, I really appreciate that. I like this kind of Trojan horse idea that, come to the book thinking we're getting some kind of basic, self-help. This is how you kind of relax and slow down and decrease your expectations. And I think that's all true. Like, I really think it is good for us to relax and slow down and decrease our expectations. But I also think it's an unfair burden to put on individuals. And one of the sharpest responses I got to the op-ed, someone in the cut who basically said, knock it off, you hypocrite. Like, you're telling us to slow down, but you're writing all the time. What's going on there? And I think it's a fair point, but then that's why the op-ed was more focused on the kind of philosophical, literary side of things. And I wanted to develop the political vision here, because part of my point is that it's not fair to ask individuals to deal with all of this. It's not fair to sort of say, you just kind of go and do less, and don't worry that, you can't afford to buy a home anymore, or you can't live where you want to live, or you can't afford to eat, or you can't afford medical care. Just want less. And that's really not the point here. Like, sure, we need to be able to deal with difficulty and tragedy, but we need to have that linked to a social vision. And so I want it to be, like a self-help book that's connected to a kind of general social well-being, and really sort of saying these two things can't be separated. And really should be thought about together. In terms of I think towards the end of your question about greatness, you said it kind of what I would have responded, right? Which is actually, these are kind of the same things. This kind of excess, tawdriness, and the social hierarchy, that they both have this effect where we think they're going to be good, and we get very, we want more than we have, or we want to have power over others, and both of them wind up having these kind of negative repercussions, not necessarily for ourselves. And I think one of the things people have asked me about with this book is the show like Succession, and people say, don't like, look at how bad their lives are, and don't you think that the culture is kind of turning and showing us that we don't want to be rich anymore, it's just as bad as anything else, these people are awful. And yes and no. And I think this also connects back to what you were saying about self-help and social goods is, if you're going to live in a world where things are going to be difficult, right? You're going to have some problems and some suffering kind of no matter where you are. It's much better to have also a home and food and the money you need and the goods you need, and still fight with your family than it is to fight with your family when you don't have any of these things, right? So just sort of saying to us, well, look, their lives are bad too, isn't it miserable, kind of, and there's almost this kind of, I don't know, do you feel bad for them? Do you start rooting for some characters against others, these kinds of things. So I want this to really be that there is some kind of, in Winnicott's sense, some real way in which it's self-defeating. And the pursuit of greatness winds up undoing the things that it's meant to help us to do, whether that's feeling good about ourselves or having a functioning society, either way. And so that's why they're linked for me. Though you're certainly not, other people have sort of said, is greatness too capacious a category? Do you try and bring in too much with it? But these are the ways in which it's linked for me, are these various processes by which we're trying to kind of get to the top and get all the resources in one place, whatever effects that might have, and looking at the actual consequences of that, and looking at other ways of life that can be more fulfilling and meaningful for more of us.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I'm free associating, but on the subject of how difficult it is to live a decent and materially sufficient life when the sort of larger economy or the social milieu that you occupy or something like doesn't support that. I like the movie Nomadland stands out to me. It's like, oh yeah, that's sort of what that movie was about, isn't it? Like, it's like somebody who's seeking sort of decency and material sufficiency in a world that's hostile to it. One thing that I think hasn't come out in the discussion so far, but that I really enjoyed about the book is that it's like very wide ranging. It's very eclectic. You draw on lots and lots of sources, many of them philosophical. There's a little bit of Rawls in there. There's a little bit of Zhuangzi in there. There's Buddhist philosophy and Africana philosophy and virtue ethics and so on. I think that's part of what gives the book its richness. I think there's also like, I think that can be hard for a lot of reasons. Like one thing that I think can be hard in doing that sort of thing is that, like, if you're drawing on lots of different intellectual traditions, these are, the core ideas of these intellectual traditions aren't always logically compatible, right? And so there's this sort of possible danger or possible concern that well, you've sort of brought a bunch of ideas together, but then the overall picture somehow pulls you in a bunch of different directions because the traditions pull in a bunch of different directions. So I guess one question is sort of how do you manage that, or if that's not the right way of describing perhaps the difficulty in drawing on all these different traditions, then like what is? Yeah, I don't know if you can speak to that.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. No, I haven't seen Nomadland, so I can't speak to that, but it makes me want to go watch it. And I do think that what we do, like the book is about the links between kind of what we think, what we want, the societies that we live in. So I do think that the individual elements of that matters, and people choosing, not to pursue careers in which they're destroying the natural world to make money, I think is a good thing. And we should encourage people to do this. But we should also not even have, the extent to which it's an option, and the extent to which someone might think, well, if I don't have a career like that, I'm not going to be able to get by in this kind of modern economy. That's a problem, and one that isn't, fair to put on the individual. In terms of the kind of scattered, you say it nice, wide-ranging, eclectic. It's also kind of scatterbrained, and it is a bit how I think. Like I'm kind of been in moving, and so I've had my books in boxes. I'm sort of looking at my denuded shelves a bit sadly, because it's really about kind of pulling in various things and thinking them together. And I was thinking, one of the blurbs on the book says it's eclectic. I think sometimes we use eclectic kind of as a kind of grab bag kind of way, but there's a philosophical meaning to eclecticism that I know from earlier books. Writing about Denis Diderot and the encyclopedia, and he has a kind of definition of eclecticism there in this kind of enlightenment sense, where what we're doing is kind of sifting through. He uses kind of these harvesting images. We're kind of sifting through history, and we're finding the nuggets or the great idea, and the most kind of these really interesting pieces, and we're kind of bringing them together and creating our philosophy by finding what withstands our skepticism, or what withstands our criticism of these other elements. And that's kind of where the eclectic tradition brings all these different things together. So it's willing to discard some things in pursuit of the broader goal. I don't fully subscribe to that, but there is something of that idea here, that what I wanted was to find different ways in which ideas about good enoughness circulated in the world, and that you didn't have to buy into Buddhism or Taoism or Christianity, or you didn't have to be secular. You didn't have to kind of have any particular orientation. You can. It helps if you're a bit egalitarian, I think, but you didn't have to have any kind of solid and specific background to appreciate these ideas, right? That they really do come even from, I draw on some conservative thinkers who I think may not fully appreciate my economic suggestions, but would, I think, appreciate some of these ideas about limitation, about constraint, about the kind of difficulties, and even, Adam Smith is a big part of this book for various reasons. But so I don't, in terms of the tension that creates, it wasn't a big issue for me writing this book, and it's part of the fun of writing something that is not so strictly academic. It's like other scholarly books. I'm much more precise and checking, more my footnotes, and this was still, sorry, not to say this isn't very precise and rigorous, and I did check all the footnotes, but I wasn't trying to kind of make an argument about this is what this tradition means, or this is what, this is how these are compatible or not. I was trying to really draw on them to create the argument. So that probably does create some tensions. And I've made this argument myself about the way that sometimes people appropriate the history of Buddhism, and they kind of discard the rituals and the traditions and the kind of theories of reincarnation. There's so much in Buddhism that gets kind of stripped out when it gets secularized. And I think that we can lose some richness and complexity in that process. But that wasn't so much of a concern here. And I tried to think that through a little bit and make sure that there was things were being respected, even as I was kind of combining them and bringing them into conversation. So that's my sense that, yeah, it makes it hopefully more accessible and open, because you may not know all of these traditions, but you can find hopefully some part of yourself reflected in the book.
Yeah, that's helpful. The metaphor of sifting, I think, is a helpful one. It's like, yeah, if you might wind up, in some logical contradiction if you borrow from all of these traditions uncritically or unreflectively. But if there's the appropriate sifting mechanism built into it, then that's not so much of an issue. I guess one thing that you started to speak to a second ago is that like the book doesn't presuppose like any really specific like set of normative commitments. I think it's supposed to be appealing to people who are starting from lots of different places. And, you know, maybe some kind of egalitarianism or something like that is like, you know, you need that to like get in the door or whatever. But, you know, but this is on the one hand, this is a thing that philosophers do a lot. You sort of, you try to argue for a conclusion that you think is important from sort of moral points of view or evaluative points of view that you think are appealing to different groups of people. But I think there's probably more to it than that. At some point in the book, you talk about good enough universalism, where at least I think what's going on there is like you're trying to make a concession to the readers that's like, hey, you know, like I'm not imposing a really specific set of values on you. You know, the vision of the good enough life that I'm offering here leaves room for difference and leaves room for people to, you know, pursue their own conception of the good life. So maybe could you say a little bit more about, at the same time, you do say a lot of concrete stuff about how we should change our goals and our priorities and how we should live differently. So I know, could you say a little bit more about like what that good enough universalism consists in, or how you sort of manage the kind of balancing act of, you know, making a sort of ambitious argument for a way of life, but at the same time, like respecting that different readers are coming from different places, you know, evaluatively?
Yeah, thanks. No, that's such an interesting question. And I use the phrase good enough universalism, and I kind of marked it, and I had this plan to write a kind of side essay that developed it, and then I don't know, I just haven't gotten around to it. But so I have some kind of loose ideas about this, and it's helpful to talk them through. But I mean it, you know, in these kind of double senses of good enough. Like this isn't as you said, right? It's not a perfect universalism. I'm not sort of saying everyone needs to exactly subscribe by these sets of precepts or ideas, or this is exactly what the good is or what enough means. That I want those to be somewhat dynamic, somewhat conversational. But at the same time, I don't want to fall from universalism into a kind of empty space, kind of wishy-washy. We don't know what's worth pursuing. And so I think good enough kind of buttresses that by saying, okay, yes, there has to be some limits, right? Some things that we say, okay, this isn't good enough. This doesn't allow people to explore what makes their lives meaningful, exciting, explore their capabilities, and have enough, and have their, you know, social, emotional, physical needs for well-being met. There's a kind of somewhat more complicated answer here. That, you know, when you wind up with some kind of sense of pluralism around what constitutes what's good in life, that pluralism, the very idea of pluralism contains certain values in it, right? So if I'm saying everyone has a right to kind of develop their sense of what's good and meaningful, you can't then turn around and say, well, my pluralism is that I get to dominate everybody else, because that contradicts the very first principle of pluralism, which is that everyone is allowed to kind of develop their sense of goodness and decency. And if somebody wants to be part of your, you know, domination scheme, that's something else, and not for me to speak about, right? But in terms of kind of broader general senses of how we think about intercultural relations or international relations, and so I want that to come across, that, you know, when we talk about a pluralism or a good enough universalism, right, that pluralism has some values embedded in it, and they are the right to determine for yourself, so a kind of non-domination, and that everyone has that right, so you have a kind of equity. And so pluralism kind of brings with it non-domination and equity, which are other words of sort of saying equity in the sense of enoughness for everybody, and non-domination in the sense of the ability to determine your own set of goods, right? So this winds up even in still a kind of good enough basic place. when we get into institutions and how people can kind of deal with each other and work this out across real differences, that sort of winds up being case by case, but that's the broader sort of vision I wanted to work through.
Yeah, thanks. I should say, if people want to add in, I'm asking questions of my own here, but if people want to add questions in chat, you're very, very welcome to. Another, I guess, a related question, maybe it's not obviously related, but I think it's related, is about what material sufficiency, or like the enough part of good enough, amounts to. So, what seems like a decent standard of living, varies widely across time and place, right? And so at a kind of economic level, sufficiency at least appears differently, depending on your social location, right? But then it also at a kind of, because in addition to the economic stuff, you're talking about the personal and the relational stuff too. Like sufficiency in those contexts means something different depending on who you're talking about. Some people are more introverted or more, hermetic or whatever, or just more needy in their relationships, whatever it is. So it's the idea of trying to provide what's sufficient, what's enough for people is really compelling, but it seems like it's a hard target to pin down. And the fact that you're allowing for different conceptions of the good life, which might come with their own conceptions of what's enough, might complicate the matter. So I don't know. How do you think about this? How do you think about how our sense of what counts as enough changes over time, and when we should sort of capitulate to it, and maybe when we shouldn't capitulate to it, when what seems like enough might be too much? Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, no, and it's a question I do kind of, again, try to wiggle around a little bit in the book, because not because I don't have some general set of answers, but because I don't think they're necessarily my answers to give. Like, this has to be a dynamic conception. It's not just about, okay, these are the, I'm going to do this a little bit, right? We know Credit Suisse does these global wealth reports, and it was something like $400 trillion is global wealth exists, whatever that means. Although that's in assets and things that who knows how to price. But if you divided that up among the population, everyone would have $77,000. And so we could say, okay, like, I don't know, everyone should have $77,000 worth of wealth. Maybe some people would have 50 and some people would have 100. I don't, but it doesn't mean much, because once you start doing the dividing, all of a sudden the value of the assets completely changes. And so you can actually kind of come down and say, well, we just split it up like this. It would involve selling property or stocks or things that, you just can't do and then shift. Someone would have to buy them and so forth. So it's not so much like saying there's a number, but there are things, and a lot of people have tried to work out some of these basic ideas. You need access to food, you need access to water, you need air. If you don't have access to like clean water, you need access to somewhere to purify your water. You need education. And I think the idea of good enough is not just some of the argument here would be, well, if we can just get everyone to a bare minimum, if everyone in the world can just, not starve to death, like, great, like, we'll have succeeded. Who cares if someone else has trillions of dollars, because no one's starving to death. And that is not the conception that I'm advocating here. It really is about good enough. It's not just kind of having enough to stay alive. It's having this kind of decent and meaningful and high quality, these decent quality things, and resources that you can work with. And so that, we could ask whether that's national, is it international? I would tend to sort of think that what I talk about a little bit in the book is that if we do this on a national basis, if we think about kind of who has enough in a particular space, it causes refugee problems, it causes immigration problems, right? If one place hoards all the resources and then you have a really egalitarian place, but because it just took everything from everyone else, right, that doesn't solve the problem or our sense of kind of human indebtedness to each other. The fact that, right, borders are these artificial, important, but artificial things. So I don't, there are people who try to work out the numbers on this, and I've read some of the articles and they're somewhat interesting, but I do think it needs to be dynamic. I do think that, right, we advance and we change and we transform, and that part of the reason too is that one of the criticisms of ideas like kind of good enough life ideas is that we get stuck, right? We don't have any more innovation because we're just, okay, now here we are, we're good enough, call it quits. But I don't think that's what happened. Like, I think good enough is a very dynamic idea, in part because it brings in so many more people. A lot of what we have in society is this very competitive society where only certain people get to contribute their abilities or capacities, even though there are many more talented people than are able to do so. Some of the talents don't go recognized, some who don't interview well or don't test well, or whatever it might be. And I do believe that by bringing in more people, having more collaboration, we can advance in ways we're not sure of yet, right? In which enoughness might dynamically change in kind of fascinating ways. I mean, the one example I use in the book, just to give it some practical, we could talk about like mRNA vaccines. The iPhone is mostly made by kind of government technology. Like, there's lots of things that we use that are publicly made in the first place. The Brooklyn Public Library and all the wonderful things that come out of there. But I think there's also this interesting example that Daniel Immerwahr gives in his kind of history of United States empire, United States overseas, is that World War II forced the United States to not steal other people's rubber. I mean, basically. And so they tried to create synthetic rubber here. And there's the scientists who talk about that time when they make this achievement, this breakthrough, and they say this is amazing because for so long we were dispersed, right? We were competing with each other, and there would be a bit of knowledge here and a bit of knowledge there, and we were all trying to make money off of our processes, but we weren't able to kind of make the breakthrough. Then the government was paying us to work on this together, and we got synthetic rubber, right? It was that kind of bringing people together where advance and so forth got made. And so I do think that things like that would happen in this kind of good enough world. So it's a long answer, but just to talk about the idea that it would have to be a somewhat dynamic sense, and it would keep changing, but it would be one in which we would try to keep everyone close to, some people might have a little more, some people might have a little bit less, but we're kind of in proximity to each other, as opposed to just in these ridiculous separations.
Yeah, this is, I think you began to speak about this a little bit just now, but Joel G asks in chat, not everyone means well, what to do about that? So I guess you're talking a little bit about sort of how people can be motivated to do what are sort of collectively extraordinary things, making the internet or synthetic rubber and so on, even in the absence of, capitalist competition or competitions for prestige or something like that. But there's a flip side, I guess, which is Joel's question, which is like, it's not just a question of how do you motivate people to do extraordinary things, but how do you motivate bad actors not to do horrible things? And maybe under the sort of greatness model, they're motivated by a desire not to be at the bottom of a social hierarchy, and they're not, but that option is like maybe isn't open to you. So yeah, you've talked a little bit about how to motivate people to do really cool pro-social stuff. How do you, I guess there's the flip side is like, how do you motivate people not to do the antisocial stuff they might be tempted to do?
Yeah, sometimes these kind of straightforward questions, of course, are the hardest because they ask these kind of fundamental, how do we get people to be good? And it's like, I don't know, I have some ideas, but it's a very complex question, in fact, that Joel G is asking. But part of what I talk about in the nature chapter of the book is that humans are not determined in a particular way naturally, right? From whatever we've been able to understand, we do have genetic dispositions. We do have some traits that are passed on or inherited. I'm not sure where meanness falls on that scale of inheritance, but I don't think in general that people are solely determined even by their makeup. And in fact, we are these plural beings, and what the neuroscience tells us, what the primatology, the kind of evolutionary science tells us, is that we have competing capacities within us. So Franz de Waal, for example, the great primatologist, says, we have a hierarchical strand and we have a nurturing cooperative strand. Both of those things are operative in different levels in each of us, and we can, in fact, design societies that draw out a bit more our cooperative side. Will we get rid of the dominating or the hierarchical, the cruel side of things? No. Right, and that's why this is a good enough vision. I can't get rid of people being a jerk sometimes, or some degree of human imperfection, and I don't know how we would go about that, and I don't know that it's something we could achieve, but we can kind of say, yes, okay, there's still going to be people who are going to be, really cruel some of the time, but we can develop a society in which it's not respected, it's not made validated, right? If it's not, you're not being praised for this, right? You're being really kind of encouraged to do what you're good at, what you can contribute. And again, I don't think that'll end perfectly, but I think we can bring out more of that by asking that of ourselves. Will it stop terrible people from doing terrible things all the time? No, but we do know. I mean, one of the things I talk about some in the book is that societies with less inequality, societies with less hierarchies tend to be ones where people trust each other more, right? And where there is kind of more interpersonal kindness. Like those numbers are, they're not perfect because they're not the easiest things to measure, but we do know that increases in egalitarianism does lead to decreases in violence, does lead to increases in social kind of pro-social behavior. So there are ways to really kind of deal with some of these things, if not ultimately kind of removing the problem.
Yeah, there's a brief, but I think nice discussion of the theorist Morris Deutsch somewhere in the second to last chapter of the book, I think, about like the conditions under which cooperation thrives and how those conditions in some ways can tend to undermine themselves. So it's just constant process of adjustment. It was maybe just one or two paragraphs, but I really liked it. Samuel writes, could you say a bit more about your sifting procedure when looking at different traditions? How do you decide what to keep, throw, or reinterpret? And were there any traditions which you ruled out completely from the start for any reason? Yeah.
Thanks for that, Samuel. And yeah, so Morton Deutsch is this one of the interesting ideas he has about cooperation is that the things that make it work, right? The ideas that we can substitute for each other, we can kind of rotate, we like each other, and so we're willing to kind of work for each other. Also are the things that start to break it down, right? So we like each other, so we develop cliques, and we rotate between positions. But as we do that, we realize there's some things we like more. And the point that he makes, and that I really agree with, is we need to be prepared that, again, collaboration, cooperation is also difficult. I think it has values that are really important and meaningful, but it doesn't mean it's a perfect panacea. And that is, again, the kind of the good enough idea here. In terms of in terms of what I was thinking about with this book, it was really the good enough idea kind of came first. And so as I was reading through things, it was really, or thinking back on things I read, it was really about finding things that did have that resonated in some way with the development of the concept. And I do really try, either in the footnotes or in the text, to be respectful to kind of what I'm doing, where I'm twisting things, or in this book or in other books that I've written, especially dealing with kind of cultural appropriation and so forth. That we really understand context and we appreciate it and we take it on board. We don't just kind of rip things out. But I did really find that there was enough, whenever I was interpreting something, there was something meaningful, some kind of kernel there that allowed me to say, okay, this adds in our development of a good enough life. And there were occasionally things, I wanted to talk more about Christianity in the book, and I want to talk more about Judaism, and I kind of want to do more on religion generally, because I think it's such a rich topic, often overlooked because there's kind of secular divides in philosophy, but so many rich ideas about kind of how do you form a society and live well together, and those were not excluded for any reason other than I wasn't ready. I didn't have the kind of depth of knowledge that I felt I needed in the time span in which I wanted to write this book. I'm starting to work on a book about wisdom, and I will bring some of those back in, and I'm going to do some more in-depth reading about that. They're kind of, how similar to what we've been talking about. Wisdom is something that cuts across self-help and kind of social well-being and how to connect them. But there wasn't, nothing was immediately excluded. I mean, there were certainly, there's nothing from fascism in the book, just because it's an ideology from which I can't really draw much. I talk a little bit about fascism's obsession with greatness. I kind of tarry with it, but it's not. I wasn't able to build much on something whose real main goal was top down. You certainly could say, as someone I do write about in the book, Karl Polanyi, would sort of say, fascism shares with some more egalitarian ideas. And idea about the well-being of the community, it just kind of subordinates that to this kind of hierarchical system. So yeah, I don't know. I'm pretty open to these things, but I'd also be happy to hear as people read it. If you read it, send me an email if you find things that you think, yeah, maybe that wasn't the right place to go, or maybe you missed out on an interesting resource somewhere. That's always helpful.
Yeah. Great. Linda writes, how can an individual live a good enough life in a not good enough world? So we've talked a little bit about how, how the wider world can sort of support the personal ambition here, but then there's the question of what to do when the wider world doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a good question. So that's it's kind of what I try to think about in the book. And one thing I think that's important is to not be hard on ourselves. Like, there's going to be times when we live in a competitive society where we're going to want to be at the top of a hierarchy, or have a nice home for ourselves, or do decently within this system. I don't think that you shouldn't sort of say, well, I'm not good enough because I'm still kind of desiring these things. You can't just jump out of these moments. But I do think there are things we can do, right? Some of it is advancing, or what I often say in the book is kind of promoting and participating in, to the extent possible, the good enough life. So where you see it possible, if you know someone, right, who is kind of fantastically interesting and wonderful, but's been left out of various things, bring them in. Or, someone who's like not that exciting, but just a decent human who has concerns, and bring them in, kind of engage people in various ways. That there are those kind of interpersonal moments. And then there is the political work, right? There is kind of working to try as best we can to change these systems. And then I also think, one of the things I talk about in the book are ways in which outsiders tend to view, I talk about people in the Holocaust, indigenous communities, poor Black women, 1920s, working through texts like Primo Levi and David Troyer and Saidiya Hartman. And one of the things that they talk about is it can sometimes be quite offensive, or Viktor Frankl on the Holocaust, can be very offensive to say, well, your life was so terrible, nothing interesting could have happened to you. It's just all shame, it's all terrible. Nothing good or decent could have happened in your lives. And what these writers, maybe Levi less so, who's kind of really, I think, feels the limits, right, at which maybe something can't even be good enough. But Hartman and Troyer, really try and bring out, say, yes, okay, the history of indigenous people in the United States is full of violence and mayhem, but it's also full of survival and community and invention and creation. And we need to, think about and praise those moments, and, understand where they happen for other people, for ourselves, for our communities. So I think there's a lot of ways to go about it. I think, my vision is that it would require ultimately like just working for creating that good enough world, but there's steps along the way.
Great. Danny writes, I've lately been thinking about this idea of the good enough in relation to what Kim Stanley Robinson has called optopia for climate futures. Kim Stanley Robinson, the science fiction author, imagining futures that are not utopian, but rather realistic or optimistic scenarios with an aim toward action in the present. Is good enough optopian? Maybe this is reminding me of your discussion of Ursula Le Guin and the Dispossessed, which is also a science fiction book about a society which has figured stuff out that we haven't, but is still certainly not perfect. Yeah, is it optopian?
It's funny. I'm like looking over at the Ministry for the Future here, the Kim Stanley Robinson book I just read, and I'm like debating, because there's a line in it where he says, basically, I read this after I wrote the book, and there's a line where he basically says something like, everyone should have a good life and no one should have too much, and that's really all there is to it. And I was like, oh, why did I write this book? It's really kind of condensed there. I mean, obviously there are details to explore, but I think that's, so for people who haven't read it, it's a very interesting book. I don't know if this is what Danny's referring to, or other writings by Kim Stanley Robinson, but I think a lot of his work is thinking about, right, these we're in a bad place. Like, we've really kind of in terms of climate things, we've overshot. There are ways in which we can limit the damage, but we're already in the damage, right? We're already seeing the kind of droughts and the wildfires and the refugees that are being produced in this and so on. And so, how do we kind of develop some meaningful future in that space? And I think that, writers like Robinson, Le Guin, looking at kind of other, not necessarily strictly ecological moments, but are helping us to imagine, right? This is the kind of worlds we can hope for. And yeah, I mean, like, The Dispossessed for me is such an interesting book, recommended by a friend of mine. As sort of thinking, what does utopian societies look like? And The Dispossessed, Le Guin really takes us through the society that really tried to be utopian and kind of lost its, its fiery core. It's what kind of drove it, and required this kind of reignition. And what happened in that process, though, where it loses its power, is that prestige comes to overtake wealth. And so kind of like power within the community comes to have this other place. But the idea or the insight or the value is still there. And I think what Robinson does, or what Le Guin does, is by creating these futures that are imperfect, it's preparing us, right? Like, yes, we need to get out of this problem, but we can't imagine we're going to get out of it perfectly. And we need the imaginative resources, just like Winnicott's child, prepare, through the failure, through the limitation. That's where our creativity and adaptability comes from. So yeah, I think that's, I'll have to look at that particular phrase that you mentioned, but I like the idea.
Yeah, that's a really interesting connection to make. I like that. There's a little bit of a discussion of Mondragon and worker cooperatives and workplace democracy in the book, and that's something that I know has inspired Kim Stanley Robinson too. So there are a few different points of kind of affinity there. We don't have any more questions in chat, so maybe I'll just give myself one last question, if that's okay. I mean, this is a sort of canned, but I think it can be productive. It's like, what are the best arguments against the views that you defend in the book? So like, you've talked a little bit about how the sort of greatness model can lead to, through capitalist competition, can lead to economic growth, and that's nice. You've talked a little bit about how I think you alluded to this, and in the book you talk about how like, as a white guy writing about sort of rejecting greatness, that sort of reads differently to at least some Black women who've like encountered your work, that it sounds like, oh, well, as easy for you to say, given your social position, but oppressed people have to aim for greatness. That's part of the work of fighting against oppression. So you've got a couple of arguments sort of against your view on the table. Is that it, or are there other arguments that you find especially compelling, and what are they, and I guess how do you respond to them?
Yeah, no, that's nice, and that's actually the woman who came up to me was at the Brooklyn Public Library, and I don't say this in the book, but I think it was 3. It's a night of ideas, and so it's 3 a.m. after I've given my talk, and I'm pretty wound down. She came with this point that was, like, I get it, and I agree with a lot of your values, but I couldn't do that. Waking up every day as a Black woman, I couldn't just kind of be good enough. And I think that does touch on a lot of what we've talked about. How do you be good enough in a world that doesn't support it? And I think, part of it is sort of saying, look, this is complicated. Like, history matters and identities matter, and it's complicated to think through that problem and what that means. And I have some ideas that I try to engage with in the book about it, but also to sort of say that, we do know from the history of social movements and so forth that when people rise to the top and they assume power, whatever kind of position they've come from originally, that can wind up having a lot of problems. And so, women like Ella Baker or Septima Clark in the civil rights movement, Black liberation movement, were often critical of some of the leaders who sort of, okay, we need our greatness in order to advance the cause. They were often skeptical and may have been right. Like, there's interesting histories of civil rights movement by people like Charles Payne, Barbara Ransby, looking at how ordinary people were fundamental, like knocking on doors, day to day organizing. That's what really drove the movement. And so there's some interesting tensions there, though. In terms of kind of what I don't talk about in the book, I was sort of thinking about your question, And I think a lot of the questions that have come up tonight point at, where there's problems, which is, I think one of the best arguments against any philosophical, normative, ethical ideas. Well, where does the rubber hit the road? Like, what do we do with mean people? What do we do with the fact that we can't just kind of do this every day in our lives? And part of what I talk about in the book is precisely that great ideas often get perverted in the process of their implementation. And so there's a lot in Christianity, there's a lot in Marxism, there's a lot in Buddhism about equality, egalitarian ideas. And when some of those ideas get implemented, they wind up in hierarchies, they wind up in mass murder campaigns across these traditions. And so really, like, I think the danger here and where I hope, the kind of idea about the good enough is that since we're not trying to get perfect, or we're not trying to get kind of blessedness, redemption on the other side, that cuts down on our ability to say, well, this is worth it. Okay, yes, we're going to sacrifice this, but it's going to build, a kingdom of heaven here on earth. So it's okay. It meets it, because we're not going to build a kingdom of heaven here on earth. So we can't really justify doing terrible things, because it's still going to be hard on the other side. So we need to shift some of those metrics. I think one of the most interesting, some of my students who I've talked with about this, and some friends, is that how inspiring, like you sort of said to me, how inspiring is good enough? Is it enough to motivate people? Is it really enough to say, well, look, it's going to be decent, it's going to be sufficient, it's not going to be like perfect, but you'll have a decent life. Do we need that kind of extra emphasis of greatness to kind of push us over the edge to do a little bit more? And maybe it's better to just kind of redefine great, like, let's just say greatness isn't, dominating other people, it's helping them. That's great. Like, why don't, and greatness kind of retains that value, whereas good enough sounds a bit like, good enough. But again, because I really do believe that, greatness implies too much about perfection on the other side, right? We're going to go through this, we're going to, it lets us justify so many things. So I'm a stubborn person, I'll admit it, I'm only good enough myself. But so that is why I think I stick to this term, but also I do really believe that having that vision of imperfection, even if it might be less motivating sometimes, is important for kind of keeping our feet on the ground and moving.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, those two ideas I think are run through the book pretty consistently. That you can, that the vision of greatness will justify if people doing horrible things, and that's something to watch out for. But also that people become sort of less resilient or less robust against stress or difficulty or failure if they're perfectionists, if they think that's the only goal worth pursuing. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think we'll probably wrap up here, but this is excellent. This is here's the book, so people can see the book. There's a link to pre-order it, I think, from Greenlight Books in Brooklyn in the chat, so people can go check out that link. Again, thank you so much. It's an excellent book, and this was a really fun conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming. Thanks so much, Ian and BPL again for hosting. It was really lovely to be here, and great questions, everyone. So thanks so much.
Yeah. All right. Bye.